There are families that grieve quietly. They pull the curtains, hold each other close in darkened rooms, and let time do what it has always done. And then there are families that grieve in a way that eventually starts to feel like something more than grief, something that makes the people around them go still, not because of what is said, but because of everything that isn't. For years, the name Nancy Guthrie has carried the weight of loss, deep, staggering, undeniable loss, the kind most people cannot imagine surviving, let alone speaking about in front of strangers. She lost her daughter, and then, not long after, she lost her son, 2 children, both gone. And the world watched, because stories like that don't stay behind closed doors for long. People mourned alongside her. They sent letters. They wrote on message boards and in the margins of her books. They spoke to each other about faith and pain, and the almost impossible grace some people seem to carry. When life has taken everything it can take, Nancy became, for many, something more than a grieving mother. She became a symbol, a voice, a source of comfort for people who had nowhere else to turn with their own unbearable losses. But symbols are not the whole story. They never are. And the people who live closest to a symbol, the ones who see what happens when the microphone is off and the audience has gone home, those people carry a different kind of knowledge. Recently, Nancy Guthrie's son-in-law broke his silence. After years of saying nothing publicly, he spoke. And what he said, according to those who heard it, was not a tribute. It was not a defense of the woman the world has come to know. It was something harder than either of those things. Something that, once heard, apparently left more questions hanging in the air than it answered. What exactly did he say? And why did he choose now, after all this time, to finally say it? Those questions matter more than they might first appear, because sometimes the truest things about a family don't live in the tragedies themselves. They live in the long, carefully maintained silence that surrounds them. To understand why any of this matters, you have to go back to a life that, from the outside, appeared to be built on something unshakable. Nancy Guthrie grew up with a faith that was never casual or inherited in a passive way. It was something she leaned into fully, the way certain people lean against a wall they are completely certain will hold. She married Todd Guthrie, and together they made a life in Nashville, Tennessee. A home, a family, a sense of grounded purpose that seemed anchored in something bigger than the daily rhythm of ordinary living. They had a son named Matt, then a daughter named Hope, and for a while, their world looked the way certain worlds look when they are whole, full in a way you rarely notice, until it begins to empty. Hope was born in 1998. Almost from the start, doctors identified something deeply wrong. She had a rare metabolic disorder called Zellweger syndrome, a condition that attacks the nervous system, compromises the liver, and leaves almost no part of a young body untouched. Children born with it rarely survive past their first year. Nancy and Todd were told this early. They understood what was coming, with a clarity most parents are spared, and yet they chose to bring Hope home, to hold her, to love her through whatever life she had left to live. Hope died 6 months later. The grief that followed would have hollowed most people out completely. According to the story Nancy went on to tell, in books, on stages, in churches across the country, it didn't hollow her out. It redirected her. She began to write and speak about what it actually feels like to lose a child, while still believing in a God who could have stopped it. She stepped into a space that most people avoid entirely, and she spoke honestly about the questions that live there. In many Christian communities, she became a rare and valued voice, trusted, admired, sought after. And then Gabriel was born, another child, another diagnosis of Zellweger syndrome, the exact same condition, carrying the exact same prognosis. The statistical odds of this happening twice within one family are extraordinarily rare, the kind of coincidence that strains belief. And yet it happened. Gabriel lived for 18 months, and then he was gone. 2 children, 2 diagnoses, 2 funerals, and a mother who kept standing up in front of crowds and speaking about the goodness of God. That is the foundation this story is built on. That is the public identity Nancy Guthrie constructed around the losses she carried. And that is the world her son-in-law has now, quietly, carefully, but unmistakably, complicated. There is a version of Nancy Guthrie's life that most people know well. It lives in her books, and on the stages where she has spoken, and in the carefully shaped narratives of Christian grief literature. In that version, she is a woman who suffered at a depth few will ever know and found, through that suffering, a clarity of purpose she might never have reached any other way. Her story has an arc: pain, then meaning, then something that resembles, though never fully becomes, peace. She wrote a book called Holding On to Hope, then another, and then another after that, each one returning to the same territory: the deaths of her children, the questions she put to God, and the answers she eventually found or learned to live without. The books reached people in hospitals and hospice waiting rooms, and the particular silence of 2 in the morning, when loss refuses to let someone sleep. By most accounts, they brought real comfort to real people in very real pain. Her son-in-law was never a visible part of that public story. He was the man who married Nancy's surviving child, who entered, through that marriage, a family already defined by its grief and its platform. He lived adjacent to the narrative rather than inside it. He watched from a specific kind of distance, close enough to see the full picture, far enough that the outside world had no reason to look at him. For a long time, that arrangement seemed to hold. He had his own life, his own work, his own quiet sense of what the Guthrie family was and wasn't, and he kept those observations to himself the way people do when they understand, instinctively, that some families have made a decision about the story they tell, and that stepping outside it carries consequences that are easier to avoid than absorb. But things were forming beneath the surface, not accusations, exactly, not grievances in the conventional sense, more like observations that accumulate slowly over years of watching something from the inside, that the outside world only ever sees in edited form. The gap between those two perspectives is tolerable for a while. For some people, at some point, it becomes something they can no longer hold. The son-in-law's silence lasted, through book releases and speaking tours and the particular kind of visibility that grief can generate when it is packaged and shared in the right communities. It lasted through family gatherings and public appearances and the quiet, steady machinery of a life built around a very specific narrative. And then, according to people familiar with the situation, it didn't last anymore. He didn't call a press conference. He didn't put anything on the internet. What happened, according to reports that have since circulated among people close to the family, was far more personal than that, more contained, and possibly, because of that containment, more affecting. The son-in-law spoke to people he trusted, to individuals who had their own complicated and layered relationships with the Guthrie story. And what he said, according to multiple accounts, centered on something genuinely difficult to summarize, without flattening it into something it wasn't. He raised questions about the emotional reality that lived behind the public image. He spoke about what the family was actually like behind closed doors, not in a way that pointed toward anything criminal or legally actionable. No investigators have been called in, and no formal claims have been made, but in a way that suggested the polished narrative of grace under suffering was, at the very least, far more complicated than the books and the conference stages had ever let on. The questions he raised, according to those familiar with what was shared, centered on the way grief was managed within the family, or perhaps performed, whether the public persona Nancy had built served the people living alongside her, as well as it served her platform, whether there were moments, private ones, where the theology of suffering she preached so openly created a kind of pressure on the people closest to her to suppress their own, messier, less organized responses to loss. Grief is not a uniform experience. Two people can lose the same child and grieve in entirely different ways, on entirely different timelines, with entirely different needs. When one person in a household has constructed their entire identity around a particular way of processing loss, and when that way has been validated and celebrated and, over time, monetized, it becomes very hard for the people around them to grieve differently without feeling like they are somehow getting it wrong. That, according to people familiar with what the son-in-law shared, is part of what was communicated. Not an attack, not a condemnation delivered with anger, but a naming, slow and careful and long overdue, of something that had gone unnamed for years. The recognition that a family's public story and its private reality can pull apart from each other, in ways that have real costs, costs that are paid quietly in the background by the people who exist on the margins of someone else's carefully constructed narrative. No official statement has been released. No formal accusations are on record. What exists is something more fragile and more difficult to dismiss than a legal filing, testimony, the kind that cannot be easily verified or easily swept away, the kind that simply sits in the room and asks to be taken seriously. When someone becomes publicly known for their suffering, something strange and almost invisible begins to happen to the people living around them. They stop being fully themselves. They become supporting characters in a story they didn't choose to be in. Their own pain becomes context for someone else's narrative. Their healing, or their failure to heal cleanly, becomes backdrop. Their needs slip to the back of every room. This is rarely intentional. In many cases, it is simply the natural consequence of a particular kind of public visibility. Nancy Guthrie, by most accounts, genuinely believed, and very likely still believes, that speaking about her losses was a form of service, a way of reaching people navigating grief who had no map and no companion for the journey. But the questions her son-in-law raised point to something that doesn't require bad intentions to be real. When a family's pain becomes public property, when it gets shaped into books and keynote addresses and weekend seminars, who actually owns that story? Who decides how it gets told and what gets left out? And what happens to the people who lived through the same events, but carry them in completely different ways? Todd Guthrie, Nancy's husband, has spoken publicly about their shared experience of losing two children. In most accounts, his perspective runs closely alongside hers. But closeness is not always authenticity. Sometimes it is simply the path of least resistance. Inside a marriage where one person has become the designated voice for a wound they both carried. Their daughter, the woman the son-in-law married, grew up inside a household defined by death and faith and the particular, invisible weight of being the child who survived when others didn't. That kind of upbringing leaves marks that don't always surface where people think to look. They surface in relationships, in the way someone moves through conflict or intimacy, or the ordinary small disappointments of a life that has been lived since the beginning. In the long shadow of enormous loss, the son-in-law watched his wife carry that inheritance. What he observed over years, what he eventually felt compelled to speak about, according to those familiar with the situation, was a portrait of a family where the public management of grief had created a kind of internal pressure that the family's private relationships were not always able to absorb. No conclusions have been formally reached. No investigation is underway. What exists is the account of someone who was present, not for the original tragedies, but for the long, complicated aftermath. And sometimes the aftermath is where the truest things finally become visible. There's a particular kind of pain in watching someone you love be celebrated for something that also hurt you. It is not jealousy. It is something quieter and harder to name than that. Something closer to erasure. The sense that the very thing doing you harm is being applauded from a distance, and that speaking honestly about the harm would cast you as the villain in a story where you are supposed to be, at most, a minor supporting character. People who knew the son-in-law describe him as someone who carried all of this quietly, for a long time, not with bitterness, not with the sharpened edges of someone preparing for confrontation, more like a person who has been carrying something genuinely heavy and who, over the years, has simply grown tired in a way that starts to show. What finally moved him to speak, according to those close to the situation, was not one single moment. It was the accumulation of smaller ones. A comment that landed wrong, an afternoon in a family setting where the gap between the public narrative and the private experience became, for just a moment, too wide to look past, and then the slow, difficult realization, perhaps arriving suddenly, perhaps building for years, that continued silence had become its own kind of dishonesty. He did not go public in any conventional sense. No rebuttal was written. No memoir was drafted. No podcast appearance was arranged. What he did was quieter than any of those things. He spoke to people he trusted. He said what he needed to say in the spaces where he felt safe enough to say it. And then those words, the way words always do, began to travel. What makes this significant is not only the content of what was said, though that content has clearly affected the people who heard it. What makes it significant is that it happened at all, that someone who had every reason to remain silent eventually chose otherwise, that the margin of the story found its voice, that the quiet witness decided, finally, to witness. No investigators have been involved. No legal claims are expected. What sits at the heart of this is not a crime. It is something more common and, in some ways, more difficult to address than a crime: the question of whether public goodness and private harm can occupy the same life at the same time, whether a person who has spent years helping strangers process their grief might simultaneously be making it harder for the people closest to them to grieve at all. Those questions have no easy answers, but they are being asked now in circles that had never asked them before. And the person who put them into the air was someone who was there, who watched, who loved people inside the story, and who decided, in the end, that truly loving them meant he could no longer pretend everything was as simple as it appeared. Nancy Guthrie's story has always existed in a very specific and guarded space, the space where personal tragedy intersects with public faith. It is a space with its own rules and its own language and its own quiet expectations about what healing should look like and how long it should take. And it is a space that is extraordinarily difficult to question from the outside, without appearing cruel or faithless or simply ungrateful for the comfort it has offered so many people. But the son-in-law's account did not come from the outside. It came from inside the frame of the picture, from someone who had lived close enough to the margins of this story to understand what the margins actually contained, and what he apparently described carefully, without dramatics, in the measured way that people speak when they have waited a very long time to say something and want to say it correctly, was a family whose interior reality did not always match its exterior presentation. That is a serious thing to say about anyone, not because it implies wrongdoing in any legal sense, but because it points to something that is in many ways harder to address than legal wrongdoing: a sustained and perhaps unconscious pattern of narrative control that shaped the emotional lives of the people nearest to Nancy Guthrie in ways they may not have been aware of and could not always name. There is a form of grief leadership that genuinely serves people, that takes the rawness of personal loss and metabolizes it into something that helps others survive their own. And then there is another form, quieter, less visible, harder to identify from the outside, that uses pain as building material, that turns loss into foundation, that constructs a self so thoroughly round suffering that the suffering can never fully be allowed to resolve, because resolving it would mean dismantling the self that was built on top of it. Which version lives here? Honestly, no one outside this family can say with certainty, and no official conclusion has been reached. The truth, as it almost always does, probably lives somewhere in the complicated middle, the place where good intentions and real harm can coexist without either canceling the other out. Nancy Guthrie almost certainly believes she's helping people. She may well be helping a great many of them, and she may simultaneously be doing something else, something quieter and less intended, to the people who share her daily life and her private world. That is the psychological complexity the son-in-law's words have surfaced. Not a clean story of good versus bad, not a verdict, a question, the kind of question that, once it has been asked aloud, cannot be unasked, the kind that stays in the room long after the conversation has ended, and asks you to look more carefully at things you had previously accepted without examination. The silence is broken now. Whatever the full context, whatever the complete texture of what was said and why, the words are out in the world, and broken silences have a way of changing things, not all at once, not completely, but in ways that tend to last. At least some of the people who have followed this family's story will read it differently. From this point forward, that is already a change, and sometimes change, even when it arrives uncomfortably, is exactly the shape that honesty has to take. We live in a world that is genuinely hungry for stories of endurance, for people who have been broken by life and found some way, against all reasonable expectation, to keep moving forward. We need those stories. They carry something true in them about what human beings are capable of surviving. They remind us that suffering is not the final word, but we also owe it to ourselves and to the people whose stories we consume to be honest about what happens when we turn a grieving person into a symbol. When we do that, we make it very hard for them to simply be human. We make it hard for the people around them too. We create a kind of collective pressure to maintain an image that has become, for far too many people, a source of something they cannot afford to lose. And hope, when it is held that tightly, can begin to press.